I'm Dan Perolik. I'm going to be talking with you today about how to effectively implement missing middle housing into your age-friendly action plans. I wanted to start this presentation about, first of all, talking about the strong need to reframe the way that we discuss housing in our communities and how missing middle can play a role in that. So this concept of these different range of housing types has played a role in our architecture and planning work for the last 20 years, but more recently sort of has been more directly integrated. But about 20 years ago, we actually started a master planning process in the community of Isla Vista in Santa Barbara County. And the second we walked across sort of the threshold into the room with the citizen advisory group, there was an immediate message from this group that we do not want housing that has a density of higher than 17 units per acre. And this really caught us off guard. We're like, well, what is it about 17 that's sort of the magic number? Why isn't it 17.1 or 16.5? Couldn't really get a lot of good answers. And so we had to really drill down into what it was about a certain density or their perception of a density that they thought would be bad for their community. So what we did is we went out on a walking tour, and we walked through a number of different neighborhoods adjacent to downtown Santa Barbara. We saw cottage courts, we saw a great range of missing middle types, duplexes, fourplexes, and ultimately we came to this courtyard apartment that's shown on the slide here. And everybody in the citizen advisory group loved this courtyard apartment. They said, so I said to them, so if we can do a plan and write new zoning that enables these types, would you support it? And they said yes. So, I did the nerdy thing that we do as planners and architects. So I said, well, give me a couple minutes. I went around and I counted the meters, I counted the doorbells, I counted the mailboxes, and I came back after doing some quick calculations and said, by the way, this courtyard apartment that you all love has a density of almost 45 units per acre. And so what that did is it immediately changed the conversation away from this number that sort of had certain connotations, and it shifted the conversation back to a conversation about scale and form, and really back to these building types that we're going to discuss, that we have discussed and related to missing middle housing. So as one point of reference in our recommendations, I'm going to highly recommend as a starting point that we stop using the scary D word or the term density, because if you've ever read George Lakoff's book, Don't Think of an Elephant, the second you come into a housing conversation and you start framing that conversation with a term like density, it's going to be really hard, if not impossible, to win over a community. Rather, let's start talking about housing choice, let's start talking about missing middle, let's start using photographs to have that conversation about the need for housing choice. So once again, it's like photos, they are worth 1,000 words. In this conversation, they're probably worth more, but show local examples like this great example of the triplex, and have a conversation about what it is about that type that does or does not fit within the community. And I think just as importantly, talk about the types of people who live in these types or who want to live in these types to sort of get it away from sort of planning and technical terms and about, the teachers, the firemen, the young couple, the downsizing baby boomers, your aunt, your uncle, your best friend, like personalize the story and sort of make that a part of the conversation, because it really, I would say more often than not, each one of us has a personal story about how they have lived, or they have a brother or a sister or a relative that have lived or currently live in one of these missing middle housing types. So once again, just reinforcing this concept, missing middle as a range of house scale building types that just happen to have multiple units in them. I just wanted to reinforce that as we're thinking more specifically about implementation. So where and how can missing middle be applied, right? It can be applied to make more suburban, auto-oriented environments more walkable and provide more housing choices and more livability and more age-friendly aspects of that transformation of the suburban environment. So it might be a sort of dead strip malls or dead malls themselves that are going to be redeveloped into walkable neighborhoods in integrating missing middle. It might be the creation of complete new neighborhoods. If you're a community that still has growth areas where instead of growing in a suburban car-dependent pattern, you might plan for new neighborhoods that are oriented in a walkable pattern that integrate missing middle types. Or maybe you think about a sort of a disinvested corridor in your community. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in the examples. That might be a really good opportunity to integrate a range of these missing middle housing types. And then the second aspect, or sort of different application, is actually assisting with the revitalization of urban places. And it might be individual infill on a 50 by 120 foot lot. It might be a brownfield site that's sat vacant in your community. That might be a great opportunity to stitch a new component of a neighborhood into your city. Might be transit, what we call transit-oriented development, where there might have been some investment in a new rapid bus line, a light rail, or some other transit that encourages the reinvestment of lots around it, where missing middle might be a great, play a role in that. And then a lot of times, whether you're a big city or a small town, missing middle can actually play a really great role in transitioning and scale from your downtown into adjacent neighborhoods. So those are just some general application ideas. I'm going to jump into some specifics here next. So the other thing that I want to encourage in terms of general approach is there's this old paradigm of talking about housing in these really basic classifications of single-family detached, or maybe single-family attached, which would be a townhouse, and then multifamily. And right, whether it be a comprehensive plan or general plan or new zoning or even a new housing study, it usually has those basic classifications. But what I'm encouraging is that we break this down and introduce missing middle more effectively, break down that multifamily category. So I often sort of chuckle inside when I see a survey that's given in a community is like, would you rather live in a single family detached house or a multifamily apartment? It's kind of like asking somebody, would you like ice cream or spinach for dessert? You're not really providing equal choices. So by introducing these missing middle types of saying, would you rather live in a single-family detached house, which likely would be in an environment where you rely on your car, or do you want to live in a cottage court with a small series of cottages clustered around a shared community space, or a 4-unit building that's the scale of a house where you still have your own entry, but it's stacked in a building and it's part of a walkable neighborhood, and all of those missing middle types, right? You frame that of that's a walkable context. So you give them more of an equal choice of really a broad range of choices to live from. So I'm going to encourage every one of you, as you're talking about whether it's general planning or your age-friendly action plans, let's break down those classifications more broadly to introduce the missing middle types. The other thing that's really important is just being very clear about different strategies for suburban environments and different strategies for walkable environments. And so just needing to think very carefully about that and thinking about how your strategies may differ in each of those. And so I just wanted to show some examples because a lot of times I'll use the term walkable urban when I'm talking about missing middle housing. And when I use the term urban, I don't necessarily mean 5, 6, 7+ story buildings. And this slide reinforces that. When I think about walkability and urbanism, it can be at the scale of a rural crossroads, it could be at the scale of a small town, a neighborhood, or it can be a larger downtown, but there's a broad range of different scales that we can be talking about. So I just want to reinforce that the applicability of missing middle is both for growing cities, larger cities that are sort of have a large demand for people moving there, but it can also be applicable to rural places that are evolving and changing. And so I just wanted to give a couple examples to show where and how the concept of missing middle has been applied to these different types of places. So just as an example, Nashville, Tennessee, one of the hottest real estate markets in the country, rapidly escalating housing prices. They just did a very proactive thing. Rick Bernhardt, who was the planning director at the time, directly integrated the concept of missing middle housing and the real need for it directly into their comprehensive plan. So that's one great way that a big city has directly embedded this concept into their citywide housing policy, which has actually delivered some really great results, missing middle housing all across the city. I'm thinking about a more rural context, actually Kauai County, and looking at the southeastern portion of the island, has thought about the different ranges of places and walkability that they have within the southeast region of their island, and thinking about how the missing middle plays a role in each one of those different types of places. So when it starts at a rural crossroad and sort of goes up to that small and a large town. And so they've actually done planning, and they've actually done form-based coding that directly integrates these missing middle types into these policies, and it's actually shown some really good results in a short amount of time. The second aspect that I want to talk about is just really directly thinking about whether you're just a general community member and trying to figure out how to remove barriers or create incentives for these types, or you're actually a planner thinking about, you're actually going to jump into your zoning code and trying to think about changes you can make. But what barriers are often present in a zoning code, and how can they be changed, and how must they be changed to enable missing middle housing? And I often compare conventional zoning. If you've ever sort of tried to open up a city zoning code, it's often written in a language that almost feels like a foreign language. It's a really thick document, very inaccessible, hard to understand. But it's also built on an operating system that we feel is out of date. So I often use the analogy of a Polaroid camera. If you were going to take a picture to put up on Twitter or Instagram or email to your friend, you wouldn't use the Polaroid camera. So, right, you'd use your smartphone. And so we feel that the conventional zoning is the Polaroid camera and it's actually not the right tool to deliver this broad range of housing choices. So we have to think more creatively about a new operating system to deliver this. And so just a couple of examples. So these two buildings, most zoning codes actually cannot tell the difference because they're the same height. They're the same densities in terms of the number of dwelling units per acre that are on those lots. They're the same height, same widths, same amount of parking. But as you can see from these slides, they are very, very different buildings. And these are the types of characteristics, like the way that one building effectively addresses the street and the way the other doesn't, are the types of elements that a form-based code can address as you think about your zoning. So there's a 15-minute test that I often do when I'm going to either start work in a city or I'm on the plane sort of working my way to give a missing middle presentation. I open up the development standards of the city zoning code, and I'll say that 90% of zoning codes, within 15 minutes, I can find 10 to 15 barriers in those codes for missing middle housing. And so need to get really specific with this. So there's some really targeted fixes, whether it be minimum lot sizes, thinking about those densities, thinking about heights and widths that can be done very effectively and very quickly. But what we actually recommend is if you're looking at a more comprehensive and long-term strategy, this strategy of introducing a form-based approach to your zoning is what we highly recommend and has been very successful in delivering missing middle housing across the country. And so at a starting point, I'm not going to dive into a lot of detail about this, but a form-based code is actually much more graphic, it's much more usable, and it's much clearer, just as a very basic starting point. A lot of graphics that support the intent, a lot less text, and a lot of what typically ends up being long, very technical, even legal text that's hard to understand is distilled down into simple to understand text that's presented in a table with a supporting graphic. And so these missing middle housing types, I guess as a really basic concept that I'm hoping everybody can get their hands around, is if you have a neighborhood or within your city, these building blocks become the ingredients of your neighborhood or of your city. And so if you think about the recipe for creating a certain type of neighborhood, there's a certain range of building types or these missing middle types that are appropriate as part of the recipe for creating that type of place. And so at the start of creating a form-based code, we usually take a fair amount of time of doing a very careful analysis of a place, and we actually develop a set of local building types or those local ingredients that make up the different types of neighborhood in a community. And there are a new set of zone districts. And what's different about this form-based approach than a more conventional zoning code is that, like within this example of the T4 neighborhood small footprint, is that there's a certain range of missing middle types directly allowed in each one of those zoning districts. And so I just encourage you, this is actually an extract from the City of Cincinnati's form-based code. These codes are being done all across the country. It's been done in Beaufort County, South Carolina, places like Mesa, Arizona, as they've sort of extended the light rail to their downtown. And so I just encourage you to take a look at some of these codes and think about how they're different, how they could be more effective in your strategies. And so thinking about, this is Cincinnati's full range of form-based zoning districts, and you can see they're very much place-based and form and scale-based, going from primarily single-family detached neighborhood to the most urban of the zoning districts of the downtown core. And just as an introduction, of like a form-based approach of a way to directly integrate the building types into a new set of zoning districts to more effectively regulate for that walkability, that livability in those age-friendly communities. If you want to find out more information, I encourage you to go to the Form-Based Code Institute's website. A lot of great information. There's a book that I wrote about 8 years ago now on form-based codes that you can get through John Wiley and Sons. I just encourage you to just explore what's being done with form-based coding. And I do want to encourage you, as I think a lot of communities get intimidated by the idea of thinking about applying new zoning or form-based coding to a large part of their city, and say, don't be afraid to start small in terms of your strategies to make your community age-friendly, your strategies for integrating missing middle housing. This is just an example from Novato, California, where they just picked one neighborhood. It's about 8 square blocks. And they said, this is where we want to focus on the integration of missing middle housing. And we're going to actually, our approach was we're going to introduce one new zoning district to effectively integrate missing middle housing to this northwest quadrant neighborhood. And so there was a lot of issues in these neighborhoods, that there was a disconnect between their general plan, sort of the intensity of their general plan allowed and what their zoning code allowed, and also sort of conflict between what their latest or their last master plan for the neighborhood, which was done 30 or 40 years ago. So the idea was, let's deal with all these inconsistencies and let's provide clarity in delivering missing middle housing to these neighborhoods. And so you can see from this map, this is just the different number of units that are on the different lots within this neighborhood. What the inconsistencies did is it delivered a lot of out of scale and different scaled buildings within this neighborhood. So the strategy was, let's enable missing middle as a way to enable this neighborhood to evolve and deliver housing choices, but do it in a way that is compatible with the form and scale that is desired within the general plan and within the community. So the other point that I want to make is, as you're thinking about this, and I don't want to get really technical about it, but look at your zoning map. All the areas on this zoning map that are colored yellow only allow single-family detached houses. It's quite often that there's actually very little geographic area of a city where the zoning code is actually enabling missing middle. So cities have to make some tough decisions about how to expand that as they're thinking about a missing middle application. And so just a couple of concluding thoughts. I just want to get back to this thought of, as you're thinking about your action plans, age-friendly action plans, and thinking about how to integrate missing middle, just start by changing the paradigm and the way you talk about sort of the range of housing choices that you need to be delivering, and introduce this broad range of missing middle types into that conversation to be effective. And what I would say is that also think about your community in terms of different contexts and have different strategies for basically sort of the evolution of your suburban environments in terms of making them more age-friendly and introducing a broad range of housing choices, and how that may be similar or likely different than the strategies of thinking about the current areas that and contexts that are walkable, and how the strategies relate to that context and how to reinforce it. Feel free to visit the Missing Middle website at www.missingmiddlehousing.com. Take a look at the livability index that AARP has created, which is a really great resource. And I just encourage you to think about missing middle as just one very important tool in your toolbox as you're thinking about your action plan for integrating and creating an age-friendly community.